Good morning and welcome back to the Center for C-SPAN Scholarship and Engagement Research Conference. Up next is the Media Policy and Messaging panel. This panel delves into congressional hearings and congressional messaging. As congressional hearings become more visible, video clips of these events receive a great deal of attention, but can they be viewed as a type of rhetorical genre? While these videos have been studied in many ways by political scientists and communication scholars, our authors explore a new approach to analyzing their rhetoric. How issues are framed in the media is a common approach, but to understand how a single significant individual, Senator Edward Kennedy, could frame this coverage of healthcare through his positions and speeches takes us in a new direction in framing studies. This panel is moderated by Terri Towner, professor of political science at Oakland University in Michigan. Dr. Towner's research focuses mainly on the role of social media in campaigns and elections, and centering on digital platforms such as Twitter and Instagram. She recently co-edited the book, The Internet and the 2020 Presidential Campaign. In spring 2020, she was appointed as the editor-in-chief of the Journal of Information, Technology, and Politics. She's published in numerous journals, and her research has been published in several book chapters, most recently in The Presidency and Social Media, Discourse Disruption and Digital Democracy in the 2016 Presidential Election and Communication and Midterm Elections, Media, Message, and Mobilization. Welcome, Terri Towner.
Hey everybody, how are we doing today? I'm excited that we have two really great papers that are going to be presented today. I believe we're going to start with the congressional hearings as public spectacle paper first by Dr. Sheri Bleam and Joshua Guitar. Dr. Bleam is actually a neighbor of mine down the road from Wayne State University. But I believe that's where she earned her PhD in communications. Sheri then served in the Adrian College professorate for 4 decades, where she developed and implemented a communication arts program. She has concentrated her professional efforts in numerous areas, including the establishment and growth of a faculty for her new department, continued broadening of departmental and interdepartmental offerings and communications, and ongoing and has reflective program on research regarding growth and change in higher education. This paper is co-authored with Joshua Guitar. After completing a BA in communication at Adrian College, Joshua Guitar earned his MA, PhD in communication from Wayne State, right down the road from me in Detroit, Michigan. Josh currently serves as an assistant prof at the Young Harris College in Young Harris, Georgia, where he teaches classes in rhetoric, critical media studies, and Paul Com. Joshua employs both classical and critical methods of rhetorical inquiry to examine mediated political discourse, offering oftentimes to integrate rhetorical manifestations of ideology that inhibit democratic discourse, civil liberties, and political equity. His research has been featured in numerous journals, as well as in his book published by Lexington Book in 2021. So I'm anxious to start off with both Bleam and Guitar and this very first paper. You have the floor, my friends.
All right, thank you so much for that wonderful introduction, Dr. Towner. And also a quick thank you to Andrea and Dr. Browning and Brian Lamb and everyone on the back end of this conference. It really has been a fantastic experience leading into the conference, and then everything so far has been invigorating, and it looks to be a wonderful conference. So thank you to everyone who is putting on an excellent conference. And I also want to give a little shout out, or a large shout out, to the entire research team here. So Dr. Bleam and I certainly worked together and created the vision for the project. In doing so, realized we were up against a lot of work. And so I pulled in some fantastic, brilliant undergraduate scholars that work with me at Young Harris. So Jenna Thomas, Madeline Studebaker, and Matthew George. They've all worked rather tirelessly on this project with us, and they're here with us today as well. I'll be presenting most of the material today, but certainly our entire team deserves the gratitude for a job well done. I think also uniquely, I'd like to point out that, as you might have noticed from our bios, Dr. Bleam was my undergraduate mentor. And as I launched my academic career, wanted to work with her more closely on some research projects. And we jumped into this one. And then again, with the scope of our project, needed more help. And so I pulled in some of my mentees. And so we have a three generation research team going here, which I think has been pretty unique. And we've enjoyed working together, certainly. So I'll delve into our project and give the rundown. So I will say from the start, we will spend less time discussing our methodology today, because tomorrow we're also leading a workshop that specifically engages our methodological approach. So I'll certainly cover some of that because it will be helpful for setting up the project and understanding it. But I won't spend as much time on method because that's going to be engaged much more substantively tomorrow. If there are questions, certainly about method, we can talk about it after the presentations are done. But that's why I'll be spending a little less time on that and a little more on the other sections of our paper. So I don't think I have to convince anyone in the room that the recent trend in political discourse has been to create spectacle, right? Or to create these spectacular moments where that are regurgitated quite regularly in media, social media, and mass media, social media, and obviously our daily discourses that we engage with each other. You know, it's these videos, oftentimes sound bites, video bites, and audio bites get proliferated throughout all media platforms to the point of exhaustion, really. And so our beginning interest in this was, how does something that generally, historically, has not received as much media attention, or seems to be, I think, approached in a fairly persons think it might be boring, right? If I tell them I'm studying congressional hearings via C-SPAN, I can't say that they're exactly excited but when I jump into it, they start to recognize, oh my gosh, this is something that we're now spending much more time attending to. And it doesn't mean that media weren't and haven't been covering congressional hearings since the inception of the country. Certainly we have. With whatever media have been available, we have covered congressional hearings, and there have been moments of public spectacle. In fact, some of my research dates back to the First Continental Congress, and how some of those meetings were received kind of what we would call media spectacle at the time. But with the proliferation of new media, with this hyper focus on political discourse, without question, we've got this environment now where the attention is there, right? We have the means and the ability to create and understand and view and share these moments of public spectacle. So our approach here is to really engage how a congressional hearing with a committee or subcommittee might be viewed as public spectacle, in that it's a genre of public oratory. Right. So certain things that define a genre of speech. I mean, classically, we look at, say, the presidential inaugural address as a genre of speech. And there are a lot of, formal components of that event that create the genre, right? Certainly the day it's after the oath has been taken by the new incoming president, the setting, the place, all those things certainly help define the genre. But beyond that, right, beyond the confines of the speaking event, there are rhetorical postures, rhetorical ploys, rhetorical appeals that also help shape our understanding of these events of public speech or public speeches. I like that. I think it was Brian Lamb earlier in our first session said that we are a government based around public speaking, and I think that's it's absolutely true. And in what context does that rhetoric shift based on the setting, right? Or how does the rhetoric shift based on the setting? So we're looking specifically at congressional hearings in committee meetings, subcommittee meetings, to say beyond the four walls of the committee meeting, right? Beyond the chairs and who's there, how does the rhetoric function as a genre of speech so that we might better use it as a lens, the theory to use it as a lens to understand how the rhetoric is working in these settings. So just again, briefly on method, right? So we're using genre critique from a rhetorical perspective. there's a long history of genre critique in the field of rhetoric. It certainly is not without its detractors. You need to try and avoid that kind of circular logic thing where you're identifying what you're looking for, and then you find and you say, okay, we have a genre, right? So we need to do our best to move beyond that and say, yes, establish the themes of the genre, but what do those themes do? What do those rhetorical positions and postures do? And how might they be utilized so that each speech, each rhetorician, each rhetor can actually be viewed still with that level of nuance that rhetoric scholarship employs. So we started with kind of just a broad general dictate and said, all right, team, here are we have almost 100 of the most viewed, or the ones we remember in terms of creating media spectacle. Watch them, right? Watch these congressional hearings. We know that they have garnered media attention for whatever reason, right? It might be celebrity presence. It might be the topic at hand. It might be that, a couple of representatives have been yelling at each other across the room, and so the cameras have focused their attention. But jump into the hearings and just watch, right? And we created a very lengthy kind of spreadsheet, data sheet to say, anytime your interest is piqued, right? Anytime you see something of interest for you, note it, note the timestamp, and explain why that piqued your interest. And so it was just just a broad general dictate to say, do this thing and see what we come up with, so that we might be able to establish or understand or identify the themes of rhetoric that are occurring here. So Dr. Sheri Bleam actually was kind of in charge of leading myself and the rest of the team through this and saying, watch, identify which videos you're going to watch, and note what is important, what piques your interest. So from there, right, we spent several months doing this. It was a very large corpus of artifacts. In doing that, we came away with a very large data set, right? And from there, it was kind of my job to arrange the snippets into themes, right? To try and understand and develop a theory for what's happening rhetorically in a generic fashion in these types of media spectacle events. And I used the metaphor of a puzzle, right? That we know we have a puzzle to put together, but let's identify where all the pieces are first, and then I'll organize them according to the color pattern or the shape pattern or what might fit together. In doing so, we identified 3 primary roles that exist within congressional hearings, and then within those 3 roles, 5 rhetorical postures or themes that tend to exist in order for these persons in these roles to actualize or advance their political rhetoric. The 3 primary roles, right, we've identified, obviously, number 1, congresspersons, persons in Congress who are members of this committee, who are engaged in the not only the nuance of the specific hearing, given the committee or subcommittee, but also their political stances, and they understand that there's a larger audience that's watching. The second set of roles within the congressional hearings we've identified as both citizen respondents and citizen advocates. And this distinction can get a little gray at times, but in general, we view citizen respondents as persons who have been called to Congress, called to a committee hearing to respond to some type of prompt or to be interrogated by the committee. I mean, Dr. Fauci is a great example of recent, Mark Zuckerberg is a great example of recent, right, where they've been told to come to Congress and be interrogated, right? And the other one would be citizen advocates. Those are persons who oftentimes are invited by Congress, right, because of a certain issue, whether that's Jon Stewart and trying to, and oftentimes celebrities, Jon Stewart and trying to advance 9/11 first responder benefits, or Ashton Kutcher and trying to get Congress to care a little more about human sex trafficking, to bystanders in the room who might be there specifically to make a public spectacle so that the cameras get some, they get some attention on whatever issue it is they are advocating. So from each of these roles, then we identified by looking at all the snippets and trying to create themes, or seeing what the themes were. Again, 5 generic themes that exist within each role. 3 of those themes exist across all 3 roles. And then within each role, so congresspersons, citizen respondents, and citizen advocates, each role has two unique rhetorical themes that they tend to advance. So I'll go over the first three quickly, and then we'll get into some detail. So number one, foster spectacle. I know this seems obvious, but congresspersons, citizen advocates, citizen respondents, they all know that media are present. And so it behooves them to create, or at least understand, that the spectacle exists, or the propensity for spectacle exists, and to move that narrative forward. Second will be to affirm cultural values. So regardless of their role within the committee hearing, right, all persons tend to advance some type of cultural value, right? Create a connection between the topic at hand and also the deeper cultural fabric of the United States. And then thirdly is to empower Congress. And whether you're a congressperson or a citizen advocate or a citizen respondent, the general approach is to somehow empower the legislature. And this works across party lines. In fact, we see oftentimes in our sessions that we've watched that congresspersons might fight about their political values, but they will coalesce around making sure they are empowering the legislature. Uniquely then, for each active role within these congressional hearings, they each have two themes that they advance, right? For congresspersons, they also advance their political or affirm their political values, and they also will fight with each other to establish ethical primacy. They'll try and make themselves out to be the more moral or more ethical person in whatever political debate they're having in this hearing. For citizen advocates, they have to first establish the exigency, right? Why are we here? Why does this issue matter? And then secondly, demonstrate transcendence and persuade their audience, Congress, and also the public writ large, that this issue matters not just to them personally, but that this is a broader issue that needs to be handled. And then citizen respondents, first and foremost, well, after they've done kind of the first three, they will first accommodate apologia. And this is a very classical rhetorical genre of speech. And it's where we get the term apology, but it doesn't mean always apologizing. It's really a speech of self-defense. So if you're engaging in apologia, you are defending yourself, your actions. You might be apologizing. You'll be explaining why you did something, why you didn't do something. And then secondly, they will commit to collaborate, right? So they'll say, despite the problems, despite what we maybe have done wrong, what we need to work on, we commit to working with Congress to solve this problem. Right, we'll see that oftentimes. Again, Zuckerberg is a good example here, where he'll regularly say, well, yes, we recognize our faults, but we're going to do what we can to work with Congress to ensure this doesn't happen again. So in all of that, we did not have enough page space to unpack it all. So we've got some things to do in the future, but I will spend a little more time with what time I have here in explaining a little bit more about how the congresspersons in particular, how those 5 themes come out or get actualized in their public rhetoric. So the first is foster spectacle, right? Number one, oftentimes this is done by simply acknowledging that media are present, saying, hey, media are here, right? Bernie Sanders oftentimes thanks C-SPAN for being there, right? When he's leading a committee hearing. Or they'll say something like, we appreciate the media presence in the room today. They'll even make soft gestures toward the media presence by saying, hey, America is listening, America is watching, America hears you, right? They'll say to the panelists. So there's certainly that acknowledgement of media. But obviously we know this doesn't always mean that they are engaging media with a happy relationship or amicable relationship. Oftentimes they'll scold media. They'll say, well, I wish more media were here, or they'll get really upset that CNN got this report before we did. And there's a very kind of combative relationship that often exists as well in these rooms. Another way that spectacle is fostered is that there's combative discourse. The cameras are rolling and the congresspersons will fight with each other, right? Whether it's Rashida Tlaib and Mark Meadows going at it over accusations of racism, or whether it's and Jim Jordan getting involved, right, in that debate, or Don Young, the representative from Alaska, back in 2011 when they were debating Anwar drilling, was accosting a panelist for speaking out of turn and it got very combative in that moment. So there's kind of this creation of combative discourse, which obviously also fosters that spectacle. And as well, there's other times where they demonstrate the imprudence of, or they'll discuss the imprudence of the meeting. They'll say out loud, look, everyone on both the sides have made up their mind. There's no reason for us to be meeting here. Like, there's no reason for us to have this committee hearing. And yet it's still happening, which implies that this is in large part for public spectacle, that this discourse is for public consumption, right? So beyond that, right, moving to the second theme, affirm cultural values. And this is something where, despite the political banter that might exist in these congressional hearings, congresspersons will all rally around certain deeply rooted cultural values, right? Whether it's discussing freedom or liberty, equality, noting that some of this stuff does have a political bent, but that at the end of the day, congresspersons will celebrate the troops, right? Or find a way to relate the topic at hand to, say, civil liberties, right? Thirdly, and I think I'm running close to the time, so Andrew, if you need to start waving your hands when I get to close to 20, just let me know. Thirdly is to empower Congress, right? And this one comes through quite palpably at times, right? When there was a House committee meeting on when coronavirus had first kind of hit the United States, and we were all running around wondering what to do. And Dr. Fauci and a group of other medical experts were being interrogated by House committee. Chip Roy, who's a fairly conservative Texas representative, and Carolyn Maloney, a Democrat, who are overseeing this hearing, right? Get a note from the White House that says, stop the meeting. This is not an emergency meeting. Get these medical people out of there. We don't want this happening anymore. And Chip Roy and Maloney, who agree on very little, right, come together as a unit and say, absolutely not. The White House does not control this hearing. We control this hearing. Fauci and whomever, you may leave now to go tend to your White House duties, but you'll come back and you're going to answer our questions, right? Similarly, like in the Kavanaugh hearing, Chuck Grassley, when things get pretty testy, Chuck Grassley stops the clock and he says, the White House is not running this hearing. Don McGahn is not running this hearing. We are running this hearing. He actually accosts Kavanaugh too. He said, you as a panelist or as what he calls him, a nominee, are not running the hearing. We as a Senate are running this hearing. And so there's this desire to empower the Congress and say, we are the first branch of government, right? Which oftentimes gets said as well. And the last two, number one, establish ethical primacy. This is where congresspersons uniquely, right? These are the two categories that do not exist across the roles within the hearings. Establishing ethical primacy means that I'm going to posture myself and my party as being more ethical, more moral, with better values than my political opponents. And this is where congresspersons will scold others for not following the procedural rules, right? Or for going over time. Or they'll jump in and say, well, I don't know why my friends across the aisle don't believe in freedom, but we do here, or I'm here for whatever my political value is. And then lastly, affirm political values. This is a recognition that congresspersons really are always campaigning. If they're trying to get reelected, the campaign now we know is very constant. It is not a short campaign like we used to see in decades ago. Congresspersons get elected, especially in the House, and they are immediately campaigning again. So they recognize that this platform exists for them to campaign, and so they will make sure that they reaffirm their political values in this setting. And then I'll wrap up because, again, I think I'm getting short to the end of my time. The overarching way that these themes, these lenses help us understand the political rhetoric is that these are the platforms with which the messages get constructed and then get proliferated within these settings. Broadly, right, to try and explain why this political spectacle within congressional hearings is happening, we read this largely as a paradox. In one part, it is just the nature of a heavily politicized, mediated political atmosphere. It's snowballing, right? We're seeing a snowball, and it's abrasive, and whereas it is making persons less in tune with Washington, right? It's kind of creating this atmosphere of distrust, disdain. It's abrasive, it's caustic. It's like, oh my gosh, can't we all just get along and have civil discourse? The flip side, though, is that it is, at least from our read, a pushback against increasing executive power over the last few decades. And this, this research has been well noted in how the executive branch has taken its own powers and augmented them for itself, right? And we read this political spectacle, for as abrasive as it is, as a means by which Congress is waving its hands and saying, we are here and we matter. We are the first branch of government, and we intend to let you know that we are here and we matter. So whether they're doing that productively or not, it is at least, we think, a reach out against, or at least a call for, again, equitable shared governance. Complete.
Well said.
Thank you, Joshua. I wanted to open it up to questions and comments to the group, but I want to warm up with a question of mine, if I can be so rude to do so. But I do want to ask about your method, Joshua. I know you had a limited time in the presentation and you're going to be discussing this more tomorrow. But I understand that you had 92 artifacts or clips, as you mentioned in your paper.
Mm-hmm.
And I know that you noted in your paper that these were clips that you identified, or the events that you identified were from things that you remembered or events that you remembered. But I was kind of wondering, why weren't clips that were just the most watched selected?
Great question. And I'm sorry, I did fast forward past that. So they were. So we did with each the Senate and the House of Representatives, we watched, or we included in our artifacts list, the top 25 most viewed congressional hearings from both the Senate and the House. So those populated the first 50. The other 42 were ones that we remember making headlines. And in a lot of ways, this is so that we could include, like, the recent hearing of Secretary of State Blinken getting interrogated about the withdrawal from Afghanistan, right? That just not enough time for that to make, I think, the impact in terms of a view count. But because it certainly was public spectacle, wanted to be able to include some of the more recent hearings that maybe have not had the same longevity. So we did, and I'm sorry, I didn't explain that very well here.
No, that's completely fine. I mean, I think your appendix lists all of the clips or artifacts that you used, which I encourage everyone on this panel to take a look at, because I think it's very interesting that you include clips that are on confirmation hearings, as well as, hey, let's talk about aliens on the extra, do we have ET out there clips? So I think that was really interesting that you are looking at a variety of clips. And I often wonder if there is a difference between, what your themes that you're identifying on a hearing that's a confirmation hearing about Sotomayor versus the clip that's on, hey, is there alien life force out there?
Yeah, the short answer to your question is yes. This is one of the difficulties of doing what we're doing. I mean, we've theorized a very broad scope, right? And trying to note, okay, how much breadth can we cover, and kind of create a general lens through which these congressional hearings can be viewed, which still affords both the rhetor in that moment and also the scholar who might be viewing it the ability to say, okay, here's the general lens, here's the general genre, right? These themes we've encountered. How might those themes be employed, or how might the rhetoric shift or be nuanced given the situational context of the hearing itself? And so without question, there is no shortage of specificity we could get into. And we actually looked at potentially parsing that out, but we wanted to start with, again, regardless of the hearing and what it might be covering, is the public paying attention? Are media paying attention? And that's our number one and only filter for this right now, is if media are paying attention, how do congresspersons act given that they know this?
Yeah.
Great point. I don't want to hog the floor, so I want to open up to any other questions or comments for our two authors. Dr. Browning.
Yeah, you're really steeped in the in the hearings. I can tell you really know and I'm sure your students saw lots of interesting moments. I'm interested in what you just sort of said. You were focused on the rhetoric, but what about the external factors? Like, for example, I mean, and Terry said, certain hearings are different. A hearing such as labor and public welfare, we know is a conflictual committee, that Democrats and Republicans don't agree on labor or public welfare. So you would see more conflict in that. Do you factor anything like that in there?
We have not yet. And again, it doesn't mean that it's not there. And I think the benefit and detriment of a project like this is that, number one, it affords us that platform and other scholars to jump in and start identifying greater nuance and say, okay, given what we know here, how might a congressional hearing or a committee meeting that's generally bland, right, that does not get a lot of media attention, how might that differ from a Kavanaugh nomination hearing, which has so much, as Kavanaugh called it, media circus build up right before that. So I think the downfall of something like this is that it's simply, we can't cover it all, but it does afford us the ability or the lens through which to cover it all and get to that nuance and say, all right, we started from this point, and now we can explore how the political context has informed this hearing versus this hearing versus this hearing, which again will breed only further rhetoric or knowledge in the field of rhetoric.
Dr. Brownell, question.
Oh, thank you. That was such an interesting paper. And having looked at a lot of congressional investigations historically, I think you're absolutely right in terms of your point about them becoming an opportunity to push back against the constant media attention and focus on the executive and reclaim a role for Congress in the policy process, right? And just more broadly in the political process of governance. And so I think I absolutely agree with that argument. And I'm wondering if it might be worth thinking about these as a historical development, knowing that there are, throughout, it's really interesting in the 1960s, there's a lot of conversations about how with television, with the introduction of some televised hearings, there was an uptick in congressional hearings, and that really was related with new opportunities to televise these hearings. And then, of course, the Watergate hearings are widely televised, or a television phenomenon in the summer of 1973. And so I'm just wondering if what a historical lens might offer in terms of kind of this longer trajectory of these as a form of political rhetoric.
Yeah, excellent question, and thank you for the kind words. This is, I think, hopefully will make you a little happy, even though we're not historians. We do cover some history in the project, right? This buildup, and we identify this, or we explain this in the paper, and that I don't know that there's a place where we can say, here's the genesis of congressional hearing as public spectacle, right? I mean, again, dating back to the First Continental Congress, there are reports of these things, these hearings becoming, or at least leading into, public spectacle external to the hearings. So there's no beginning, right? But with increased media attention, and as we know, Congress was very resistant to media being in these rooms originally, right? It took kind of executive push to get the McCarthy Army hearings into the televised format. Congress was very hesitant to bring in radio and then television, but eventually did. And so I think this is a historical progression. And I think we do recognize that in the paper, although we don't do a full-fledged historical analysis, but there is a lead up that says, look, I'm not sure how we got here, but we're here, right? It's a very multifaceted thing happening. It's part the advent of new media. It's part heavily polarized political climate. It's part media being present and in the room. So all these things, historically, everything leads to the next thing, right? And so we cover some of that in the project. And I think without question, there's a whole host of things that could be uncovered if someone were to take on that task. And who knows, perhaps we do.
Any other questions or comments? Please raise your hand if you have one, or drop a question or comment in the chat. That would be great.
Actually, Terri, I have a question. So
Yeah.
thank you very much. Dr. Guitar, so when you've analyzed these videos over time, have you seen any interplay with bringing in personal Zoom cameras over time versus the standard cameras in the room?
Oh, God, Andrew, great question. And this was a tough spot for us because when COVID hit and things went online, I don't know, we really thought about, Sheri, jump in if you want here. I don't know that we really thought this through as we were conceptualizing the project.
I think I have
but
one
then,
comment here.
yeah, go for it.
At least one comment for now. How is that? I would say that the Zoom hearings became interesting because I was beginning to be able to watch congresspersons react to the technology. And when they would do that, their first words, say their first sentence or two sentences as they began to speak, seemed more, I'm going to go ahead and call it genuine, as in off guard. You got to know what was behind what was coming. And so it afforded a both amorphous and interesting world that I believe we have yet to explore more thoroughly.
Questions or comments? Dr. Browning.
It's always hard at these things because you've done so much work and then we all say, well, what about this?
It's totally fine. Yeah.
And what about the visuals? What hit you about the visuals?
Oh, thank you for asking.
Go for it, Dr. Bleam.
May I? Thank you.
Yeah. No, not ma'am.
I started as the lead researcher in the catalog that we began to develop. And what I noticed was that I was doing so much more than cutting together and time-stamping material. I was also making what Josh will now tell you were extensive comments, also in the comment box, a beginning analysis. And it seemed to me that most of what I noticed and most of my comments had to do with both the choices of the visual and the reactions, like the one I just gave the example of, to the idea of the visual. As a matter of fact, the emphasis that I place on this in terms of my interest has to do with, I'm going to use Josh's words now, the establishment of ethical primacy, and my favorite, the affirmation of one's own political values. Those are the ones that I went for every time. That being the case, the speakers, both the citizens and the congresspersons, began to become more acutely aware and willing to speak to the camera, very much in a, where's the camera? I want to talk to that. And they began to not speak to, say, if you were a congressperson, you began to not speak to the citizens or your fellow congresspersons anymore. You began to look directly into the camera and use the word the viewers. Do you remember when that happened? It was right, I started to notice it right in the Blinken material. They were no longer speaking to each other or to Secretary Blinken. They were saying to the viewers, or as viewers, we know that. And so the awareness, I would say, has shifted. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, and in fact, Sheri, I will then now use one of your phrases in that the microphone and camera consciousness of congresspersons in particular, and also citizens, right, especially citizen advocates, has increased noticeably in recent years in terms of their ability to know where the microphone is, where the camera is, and speak into it as if it's not a congressional hearing, right? That they are speaking to and addressing to a larger audience.
And that's part of what threw speakers when we went to digital, in that the customary placement, I'm talking about the physical placement of things. The customary placement of things had all changed. And if they were not working with staff, which many of them were not very clearly in the videos that I watched, if they were not working with IT support staff to assist them, they worked for a very long time to make sure that they were both heard and seen before they went to their prepared comments.
Yeah, and one last thing for you, Dr. Browning. I mean, we do have a data set that has a great deal of detail and nuance in terms of not the rhetorical tactics to use, right? Whether that's be delivery styles, intonation, visual gestures, those types of things. And it simply wasn't the room to get it all into this paper. So we've kind of focused on the themes and knowing that there are places to build.
Yes.
Very good. Thank you very much. And I don't want to steal your thunder, Terry, but you go to this next topic and there's nothing more visual than Senator Kennedy. In a hearing, in a hearing or on the floor or whatever, he was a presence. So the kind of and people watched, his actions and his motions and whatever. That's so.
After reading Dr. Hopper's paper, actually, I realized how much I missed Senator Ted Kennedy from being on the floor, I have to say. So I'm anxious to hear Dr. Jennifer Hopper's presentation today. I do want to thank Dr. Qatar and Dr. Bleam for their presentation. Thank you so much. I did have one additional question for you that I'll send to you via email, but I want to move on to our second paper due to time. Jennifer Hopper is an associate professor of political science at Southern Connecticut State University, where she regularly teaches a variety of courses on American government, the presidency, Congress, all of our institutions. She is the author of Presidential Framing in the 21st Century News Media, The Politics of the Affordable Care Act. Her scholarship has appeared in a variety of journals, White House Studies, International Journal of Communication, and her research interest focuses on Paul Calm, the presidency, and the news media. So I'm going to turn this over to Dr. Hopper now. Her paper is titled Same Messenger, New Messenger, Senator Ted Kennedy and the Framing of Health Reform.
Thank you so much, Terry, and I've really enjoyed the prior paper as well. Hopefully we'll get to talk about maybe the combination of topics as we move forward. I want to thank also Andrea and Robert and Brian for organizing a first-rate conference, and I know that's not always easy to do virtually, so I very much appreciate that. I'm going to share my screen. Hopefully this will work to show you my presentation and some clips of the aforementioned large looming Senator Ted Kennedy here. So I first just wanted to say a little bit about how I came to this topic. I typically research the presidency and the media and healthcare policy and framing. I was doing some research in the Nixon presidential archives, and internally in the Nixon White House, every time they were talking about healthcare, it was informed by what Ted Kennedy was doing at the time in the late 60s, early 70s, that they were organizing their proposals in response to Kennedy's to try to usurp Kennedy's ability to shape healthcare reform. They felt Kennedy was often stealing the spotlight from them. And so this first sort of turned me to Kennedy. And then during the lead up to the passage of the Affordable Care Act, it was common for Kennedy to come up as a sort of symbolic figure in a lot of that discussion. In a September 2009 address that President Obama gave in support of healthcare reform, he talked about a letter that the recently deceased senator had sent him about healthcare as the great cause of his life. So with Kennedy kind of as the bookends here, I really turned my attention to the role that he played in the larger trajectory of healthcare policy over time. Some of the research questions that informed my topic, Democrats had been proposing comprehensive healthcare reform going back to the Truman administration, but have been unsuccessful at passing major policy overhauls that would affect most Americans until the passage of the Affordable Care Act in 2010. And then when they did pass the Affordable Care Act, the substance of that policy was considerably more right-leaning than many of those that had come before it. The Affordable Care Act rests on the private insurance system, individual mandates, employer mandates. Many have noted these ideas actually bore resemblance to a healthcare plan that Nixon had advocated back in 1974. Republicans had been proponents of mandates in the 1990s, et cetera. So just kind of asking the question of how did we get here? And I wanted to look at Kennedy then as a pivotal Democratic leader on healthcare for 40 years, over 40 years, longer than any president, and kind of inquire about what his communication choices tell us about the path of healthcare debates and policy outcomes over that pivotal period of time in healthcare reform. So just a little bit about the methodology I used here. There are thousands of videos featuring Kennedy in the C-SPAN video library. I looked at his speeches and appearances outside of Congress with a major focus on comprehensive healthcare reform, of expanding healthcare coverage to more Americans. So there were 55 videos that really fit this bill specifically. And this is a framing analysis. So the thinking about framing as politicians selecting central organizing themes to try to focus attention on some aspects of an issue and to de-emphasize others with the goal of promoting a particular interpretation of what is happening. And this can sometimes produce framing contests where political elites are trying to compete to successfully interpret events for the news media and the public. One of the things I found in looking at Kennedy's healthcare communications over such a long period of time is that there are some threads of consistency in how he discussed these issues back in the 1970s up until his death in 2009. So I just want to highlight a couple of those frames that stayed consistent. One, Kennedy frequently stressed how the US was exceptional with regard to healthcare and really lagged behind the rest of the world when it came to this issue. So back in 1978, Kennedy asserted that America stands virtually alone in the international community on national health insurance. No other industrial nation in the world leaves its citizens in fear of financial illness because of illness. This is back when Kennedy is advocating a national health insurance system, a single payer system. 22 years later, Kennedy, speaking on one of the C-SPAN videos I analyzed, says that one of our highest national priorities has to be to secure healthcare as a fundamental right for all of our people. Every other industrialized nation society in the world has achieved that goal in the 20th century. In America, we continue to fall behind. So consistency in that regard. I also found that there was a sameness to the way that he used a single payer system to illustrate how high that American spending on healthcare was. So to try to really hammer home that this was an astronomical amount that the country was spending on healthcare. And I'll first show a clip of him speaking in 1988 before the National Association of Manufacturers about this.
Concern to the American people. The program I serve on the Human Resource Committee, I serve in the Armed Services Committee. The basic figures on our program, about $25 billion. By the time you get the various efficiencies, about $15 billion. To show you how those things come out with some of the ways that I've spoken about here this morning. That happens to be half of what a battle carrier group is. We're being asked in the Armed Services Committee for two new battleships. This is the equivalent of half a battle carrier group, And, you know, when you measure these matters, what we're spending now is $460 billion on healthcare. $460 billion. We were talking about my old program. That was $100 billion, 15 years ago, which would have provided comprehensive. Other countries are doing it. Canada has long-term healthcare programs. That's just a dream in the eye of people. Not that the Canadian system is the end all. But I can tell you, as just in the political matter, there isn't a leader in a democratic country of the world who's repealing their healthcare system. I mean, it isn't all bad. We don't have to replicate those. We're not even talking about the comprehensiveness of those. But it is an element, I believe, of certain human decency. And it's basically, I think, it's a measure of our humanity.
Okay. So that's back in 1988. This is Kennedy speaking in 2002.
Help it get through now.
I remember, and maybe Mr. Ball remembers, since he goes back to a long time ago. Then we talked about a universal healthcare program. The estimates were that program was going to cost $100 billion, and it was going to bankrupt the country. We're spending $1.4 trillion now. There isn't a health economist that hasn't looked at it and said anywhere from 25 to 30% of that is an administrative cost. And if we are not able to see what in trying to work through a healthcare system, we're spending now more than any other country in the world.
That kind of consistency of in different eras, proposing different policies, using then the cost of single payer in comparison to what the United States was spending currently. And he could always kind of usefully update the dollar amounts in his messaging as healthcare costs continue to grow. What he's doing then is to use the charges of critics that his national health insurance back in the 70s would have cost too much. Now it's employed in service of promoting reform, and the implication being that if opponents couldn't tolerate those costs back then they must surely agree that current spending levels necessitate some kind of political change. I will also just say, as an aside, in all the ways that the C-SPAN Video Library is an amazing resource for academics, I found myself not envying the long-term congressperson of 40 plus years who it also offers a stark reminder how much you've aged over time, like the way that we all age and gain weight, et cetera. It is a truly unforgiving record of this. And so we'll see that with Kennedy as we kind of jump back and forth through the decades. Two more consistent themes. One is the proposed healthcare reform, whatever the era is, whatever the reform is. Kennedy likens it to Social Security and to Medicare, the unfinished business of the Democratic Party. He does this back in the 1970s. He does this in the early 2000s. And this is really two-edged kind of frame as well, that he wants to both quell fears and concerns about policy change, to liken healthcare reform to those two pillars of the American welfare state, but also to indicate that if it was enacted, whatever that healthcare reform would be, would eventually be beloved by Americans, supported on both sides of the political aisle. So to make it maybe less frightening, less jarring to his audiences. And a fourth consistent theme is that from the beginning of his career to the end, Kennedy talked about healthcare as a basic human right, not a privilege, an issue of justice, of humanity, and you see some of that in the clips as well that I've shown.
Help it get through now.
Sorry. To move to some of the ways that Kennedy's healthcare framing evolved over time, there'll be a couple of things I'll highlight here. The first one is that there's a significant change in the way that Kennedy frames the scope of change that's needed in healthcare reform. In my paper, I divide this into kind of chronological eras, but for the purposes of this presentation, I'm just going to talk about them more broadly thematically. Early on in the videos that are available in the archive from late 1980s, early 1990s, Kennedy is very much a proponent of systemic reform, that framing healthcare as an area where systemic change is required. And I'll just show this clip from 1991. Oops, sorry. From 1991, where this is sort of made clear.
34 million Americans. Some of government. The public is aroused. Business and labor, doctors and hospitals, and many others agree that we cannot go on as we are. Incremental action will not do. Band-aids only make the problem worse. As Claude Pepper and the Pepper Commission clearly saw, America's healthcare system is on the wrong track. fundamental reform is essential and overdue.
So any dismissing of minor changes, that it has to be about systemic reform. And that was a common way that Kennedy talked about the inadequacy of the healthcare reforms that many of his Republican opponents were proposing at the time. But then following the failure of healthcare reform to pass under the Clinton administration, 1993, 1994, a major push by the Democratic Party for that policy change, he really adopts a completely different tone. And this is one that is much more favorable toward minimal change.
The lesson of the failure of health reform in 1994 is that a sharply divided Congress cannot make far-reaching changes in an election year. Instead of repeating that mistake, we should enact the consensus incremental reforms that have broad bipartisan support and that are achievable this year. To do so,
and so a real kind of turn here. And he also in this era really stresses we want to keep what works with the current system and fix the system's most serious flaws, again, as a way of maybe recognizing that public apprehensions about healthcare reform had often held back the ability of policymakers to move forward on such changes. In 2002, Kennedy, appearing before the National Press Club, said, "I am happy now to be an incrementalist," and I'll show you the video here so you can see the crowd reaction to that point.
For 200 years, healthcare isn't going to go away. It's going to be there every single year, and it's going to be in every single campaign till we get it right. And hopefully we can try and find a way of dealing with it. I happen to be now an incrementalist. I think we could have taken the bipartisan bill for extending it to the parents of the CHIP program, which would have reduced it about 7 to 8 million. I think you can continue to expand the CHIP program that was working effectively.
You can hopefully hear there when he says that he's happy to be an incrementalist, the crowd laughs. And for me, this is one of the things that's significant about Kennedy's framing of healthcare in a more conservative direction over time. His public persona is so caught up in being the kind of liberal lion of the Senate, champion of big progressive proposals like national health insurance, that maybe that in part shapes public perceptions of his framing of healthcare policy. And to Kennedy's advantage, potentially, if he is perceived as, even Kennedy's able to find common ground and compromise on the signature issue of his political life, then for those who aren't willing to come to the bargaining table, perhaps that makes them appear even more obstructionist than they otherwise would have. Second frame that evolved significantly over the period of time I looked at was the meaning of single payer. So I had talked a little bit about some consistency there in terms of its cost and compared to America's healthcare spending. But early in then the C-SPAN video library, he was far more likely to use single payer as a bit of a threat, as we'll see in this speech to the Health Insurance Association of America, which traditionally had been a group quite hostile to democratic health reforms.
For all these reasons, play or pay is not a stalking horse for single payer. It is a good faith attempt to reform the current private-public system and make it work the way it should. The real stalking horses for single payer are the variety of lesser alternatives currently being urged in the name of health reform by the Bush administration, HIAA, and others. They fail the tests of universal coverage and effective cost control. And those failures may well make single payer irresistible a few years down the road if you block action now.
Right. I'm offering you a moderate alternative. If you don't take that, guess what's behind door number 2? You may end up with single payer and regret that. So you should come to the table now in supporting this particular reform. Again, the Clinton healthcare reform failure looms rather large here in potentially shaping Kennedy's frames in another direction. His use of single payer is considerably less brash than in the late 1990s into the 2000s. Here's an example of him speaking in 2000.
I've been started with a single payer, as I mentioned, if you were to go in a perfect world, that's where I'd be. But I've been on 14 other bills. I want to get to the outcome of this, and I'm prepared to deal with the devil if we can get us there, because we, particularly as we move into this next century with these extraordinary breakthroughs that we're going to be out there, we can't perpetuate that kind of denial of coverage.
And one of the things I want to note here is, although it's quite different, goes from kind of talking about inevitability of some sort of health reform passing to I'll do whatever it takes to get a deal done. There is still a through line in Kennedy's statements throughout these eras, throughout the decades. Not when he moves away from single payer as the policy that he's advocating, he doesn't denigrate it, but rather attributes his move away to the improbability of getting a single payer system enacted in the United States. But he's still talking about national health insurance as a positive approach from a policy standpoint. And so you have that consistency in Democratic messaging over many years, and that might be useful to advocates of that policy today. Just for the purposes of time, I'll just kind of briefly describe maybe some of his evolution in his framing of business and business's role here over time. In the late 1980s, he was much more likely to tell business organizations, you either need to be in the ball game or outside the ball game, but we're going to get something passed. And it's better if you come to the table and negotiate and try to shape it, as opposed to deal with the ramifications of what we will absolutely pass through Congress. In later videos, he's less optimistic about this. He has learned sort of from the policy battles of the past about people's apprehensions about healthcare reform. And so he really stresses not disrupting the employer-based system of health insurance, talks about minimal obligations that the government is going to ask for business, and strongly stresses the idea that small business in particular faces distinct challenges that government has to help with in various ways. I wanted to say a little bit more about the final way in which I found Kennedy's framing evolved over the decades, and that is in his portrayal of insurance companies. So in the early 1990s, he was often talking in more vague terms about who the villains were in healthcare reform battles, using terms like powerful forces are arrayed against us, or there are status quo profiteers who benefit from the current system that are standing in the way of reform. But he never explicitly mentions who this might be. Beginning in the mid-90s and beyond, really talks about the primary villains in this story as being insurance companies. Again, this is from the speech to the Health Insurance Association of America, and you'll see what his tone is like in his remarks here.
Health America depends on a strong private health insurance industry, which will be the major means by which health insurance continues to be provided to the great bulk of employees and their families. Unfortunately, in the struggle for health reform in recent years, the HIAA has often been in the role of naysayer. You did not support my single payer proposal in the early 1970s, which is understandable, but you did not even support President Nixon's alternative. In the late 1970s, to your credit, you did support all payer rate setting to bring costs under control. But in the 1990s, when the need for action is far more urgent, you are as hostile as ever to comprehensive reform. And now you even oppose the all-payer rate setting you used to support. In addition, your private sector role has unquestionably made this crisis worse. I'm talking about pervasive existing condition exclusions, aggressive underwriting and rating practices, redlining of whole industries and diseases. These have become the rule rather than the exception. The message sent out by too many of your member companies is unmistakably clear. Don't insure anyone unless you think they won't get sick. If you make a mistake, do your best to walk away from it. Do all you can to stop Congress from acting.
I'll just cut it there for the purposes of time, but far more direct in his criticism of insurance companies to insurers themselves. They do clap at the end, but this is a rather hostile appearance in the C-SPAN video library. Kennedy also engages in what is referred to as frame shifting. He repurposes a longstanding critique of conservatives of democratic healthcare reforms, of socialized medicine, that democratic reforms would cause government to get between people and their doctors. But instead, Kennedy says that it's insurance company accountants and bean counters in insurance companies that are getting between the most personal decisions that people make with their physicians about their health. And really effective reframing for him. There were 14 videos that I looked at in which he makes that analogy of insurance agents getting between people and their doctors.
Years ago.
So I just want to kind of close out with one of the last appearances that Kennedy makes in the C-SPAN archives of his appearance at a healthcare summit in 2009, again in the lead up to the Affordable Care Act, in which he strikes a more reconciliatory tone with insurance
We've got a
companies
microphone
and
here.
others.
Go ahead. Or comment. It doesn't have to be a question.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. I join in welcoming or seeing all of you once again and this very special gathering. I join with all of those that feel that this is the time, now is the time for action. I think most of us who have been in this room before have seen other times when the House and the Senate have made efforts, but they haven't been the kind of serious effort that I think that we're seeing right now. If you look over this gathering here today, you see the representatives of all the different groups that we have met with over the period of years. I mean, you have the insurance companies, you have the medical professions, all represented in one form or another. That has not been the case over the history of the past, going all the way back to Harry Truman's time. But it is the case now. And it is, I think, a tribute to your leadership in bringing all these people together, and really a leadership of so many that are gathered today. Just in a very brief look around, you can see representatives of so many of the different interests. It'll be hard to think of those interests being together and being as concerned and providing the leadership that they are, as they are demonstrating that kind of a commitment as we have today. What it does is basically challenges all of us to really do the best we can. And I know that you and all of your staff, I congratulate Max Baucus and my colleagues who have done such an extraordinary effort today. Just say that I'm looking forward to being a foot soldier in this undertaking, and this time we will not fail. Thank you very much.
You can see there's an element of like, you've changed insurance companies in some way, like now you're concerned, now you're providing leadership, maybe you didn't in the past, but it's much more an embracing of everybody's in the same room than kind of a hostile, you're the bad guys on the outside. And he was right that it did not fail that time, though the policy was very far from what he had advocated at the beginning of his career. So I'm going to leave it there. I know I've gone a little bit over, but I want to leave for discussion and throw it back to Terri as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Hopper. You remind us how grateful we are to have the C-SPAN archives to give us those clips of a great statesman. So I thank you for that. I'm going to lob you the first question. I wanted to know more about the development of the frames. What I think is interesting about both of these papers is that the authors are all using inductive reasoning when they're approaching the clips and developing the frames. So you noted on page 5, that you were building on all the authors I would expect to see, Entman and Capella and Jameson, talking about framing. Did you build on any of your work from your book on the presidency, kind of looking for certain frames or themes or sub-themes as you watched the clips?
Yes, and in particular, at the portrayal of insurance companies kind of looms really large here because it had been such a difficulty for Democrats over the decades to get the insurance industry on board, that in prior efforts toward reform, that was often the failure to bring insurers in was often talked about as a major reason why they were unsuccessful policy-wise. And so in my book, I look at the Obama administration and the Affordable Care Act, and the Obama team was very cognizant of this, and Democrats at the time thought, we need the pharmaceutical industry, we need insurers, we need them on board from day one, because that's the only way that we're going to get this passed. So I think that definitely placed the way that Kennedy talked about insurers over time in my mind. Of course, it is also true that it meant that the policy itself and the way politicians in the Affordable Care Act case could talk about insurers was not quite as hostilely as Kennedy and other Democrats had sometimes discussed them in the past, and that potentially the policy had to be much more accommodating in substance to those industries as well. Again, the kind of right-leaning turn of healthcare policy over time in American politics. So yeah, there are some things that really did not come up in my prior studies, like the use of single payer, but some things like insurance companies that absolutely did.
Thank you. That's super helpful. And I do encourage the panelists to look at your table 1, where you kind of narrow down the frames and give examples. And you gave a really nice timeline in your paper too about, how the rhetoric and the frames had changed over time, which I thought was really helpful to see this kind of like shift and what types of words Kennedy would use as he talked about, healthcare and healthcare policy. Any other questions or comments from our attendees? Allison Novak.
Hi, Jennifer. Thanks for a great paper. My question for you has to do with something that he sort of implies in some of those videos, and I'd love to hear more of your perspective on it. It seems that in different points in time, he's invoking bipartisanship as both a solution as well as a complication to some of the healthcare policies. And I'm wondering if you saw patterns of that over time, and perhaps if that's indicative of his experiences with attempting to get support, as well as some of those failures that you talked about before, sort of the Obama type of success that was a result of some of the compromises.
Yes, absolutely. And, there are points in then his framing of healthcare issues where he is very partisan and talks about insurance companies buying Republican healthcare proposals, like the insurers are the ones writing these, and Republicans are paid in campaign contributions, and so very much a kind of strong partisan sentiment. And then there are the moments where he says, like, you know what, there's a lot we can agree on, and that's what we need to move forward on, and we need to reach across the aisle, and I'm going to be the proponent of policies to do that. And certainly there are many high-profile examples of actual policy successes of Kennedy's that were very much bipartisan. He has a bill with Nancy Kassenbaum in the 1990s that allowed people to take their health insurance with them if they left a job. He's responsible for CHIP, Children's Health Insurance Program, which he did with Orrin Hatch, another Republican. One of the things kind of strikes me is that there's a sort of a moment when Kennedy is achieving those things in the 90s and the early 2000s, when potentially the dynamic between the political parties was a bit different. And there were Republicans like John McCain who was willing to work with him on a Patient's Bill of Rights, or in Hatch once upon a time was willing to work with him on CHIP. And by the time you get to the Obama administration, there's kind of that bent of like, oh, let's bring, some of our Republican colleagues into negotiations around the Affordable Care Act. But the Republican Party had changed substantially at that point. And although they were part of the discussions, there was no support within the Republican Party for the Affordable Care Act ultimately. So it was almost like trying to apply the Kennedy model that had worked years earlier in 2009, 2010, it was a failed proposition from the beginning. And maybe it resulted in a more conservative policy without the payback in terms of Republican backing once the bill was actually in Congress. So he sort of has this moment where there is an opportunity for bipartisanship, and you can see that in his rhetoric, and it's very different from what you see before, and probably what Democrats moving forward are going to do on health reform. Thank you for your question.
Dr. Guitar.
Yeah, let me lower my hand. First off, excellent project. It's been a pleasure kind of sharing the stage here with you. So it's a great work.
Well, yes, thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I'm curious as to what this research might do or help us. How would it help inform us in analyzing other kind of big players in the Congress? I'm thinking like Obama as well, though he transitioned from the legislature to the executive, certainly also went on a similar trajectory of Kennedy in terms of being rather loud and wanted certain demanding things originally in his career, and then tapered off, became more bipartisan and more conservative toward the end. Whereas a Bernie Sanders, who similarly argues for healthcare like Kennedy did, seems to uphold the same animated stances that he has for a long time. So how does your research inform our abilities to engage other congressional actors or executive actors on the same front?
Mm-hmm. It's a great question, and something I'm trying to think a little bit more about. In some ways, I think Kennedy is a bit of a distinct case, because even as he's engaging in this rightward turn in his rhetoric, he is still so solidly associated with liberal politics and kind of a liberal persona. And I don't know that all kind of members of Congress have that flexibility in terms of their communication to be able to, maintain like their street cred as a progressive at the same time that some of the words that are coming out of their mouth and the policies that they're advocating are quite moderate and quite conservative. So I do hope that, in the sense of there are certainly limitations to studying any single member of Congress, and I talk about some of those in the paper, but that I do hope that there's kind of a model or usefulness here of saying, like, I'm going to look at how this person's rhetoric evolved over time, and potentially even Bernie Sanders, might currently be talking more about the costs and efficiencies in the healthcare system than what you would see him talking about in Congress, decades ago. And that would be an interesting project actually to look at, because I think once you look at the substance, sometimes it's you see surprising uses of then some of these arguments that they come out of unexpected mouths, I guess we could say, so that it might be worthwhile to take a close look at these figures that loom so large in some of these policy debates.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Andrea, do we have time for additional questions?
Absolutely. Actually, I have a question.
All right, perfect.
So Jennifer, I was looking at a timeline on some of the videos and recalling that several of those years would have been during the time of presidential elections. And as you know, Ted Kennedy ran in 1980, but he didn't run again after that. So I'm wondering how much of the presidential politics of that year affected what he was saying and how he was saying it.
Mm-hmm. Do you mean when he ran in 1980, or do you mean like when presidential, like, so 96 and 2000? Okay. So some of his appearances are at presidential nominating conventions, and those are a little bit tricky because sometimes he's overtly advocating for, like, Al Gore is going to do this, or like we can trust John Kerry, but he becomes kind of a surrogate for their healthcare proposals are ones that I would advocate for, certainly also denigrating whoever the Republican opponents are in that case. In those years, it becomes a little bit less about Kennedy personally and his evolution on policy, and instead it's sort of in service to the Democratic presidential candidate. But you do see that it ramps up maybe more of the partisan side, to kind of go back to some of what Allison had brought up earlier, as opposed to kind of the reaching across the aisle, the consensus reforms that you see in other times. But it'd be interesting to kind of see. I didn't chart that exactly with presidential election years, so it'd be interesting to see if there's a dynamic there.
Other questions or comments?
If I have a second to ask the Bleam guitar and your illustrious undergraduates here, really struck me some of the ways that members of Congress can't always control the spectacle, and you guys make some reference to this, but I was just kind of thinking about the Jon Stewart appearance. Apparently he was calling out members of Congress for not being there. I've read elsewhere that attendance was actually not that bad at his hearing for 9/11 workers, but they were in a big room and it appeared as though attendance was worse. So he uses that to his advantage. I think about like Alyssa Milano in the background of the Kavanaugh hearings. And so I was just kind of thinking about, like, are there parts of the spectacle that members of Congress don't have a lot of impact on, but can still certainly impact the public perception of what's going on. It sort of thought that is kind of an interesting dynamic.
Yeah, that's a great question, and thank you. And jump in, team, if you have anything here. Without absolutely their ability to recognize that the camera is on and where the camera is positioned not only matters, but they're recognizing that it matters more. And so I think you're seeing progressively congresspersons know that they're on camera and ensure that they're getting that kind of camera time, at least to the very if minimalist sense of, hey, I'm here and not playing poker, as was referenced earlier. But in fact, that Jon Stewart hearing we used as one of the primary ways for us to first start engaging these, because I mean, Jon Stewart is a very well-trained media pundit, right? So he knows. I mean, he knows that he's using those situations and that visual to his rhetorical advantage. I mean, he uses the camera and the microphone so incredibly well, persuasively, right? And in a kind of a rare occurrence, does get Congress to act in terms of extending some level of exigency. Congress does act. So I don't know that Stewart knew. I don't know that Stewart didn't know that Congress was not in the room as robustly as it should have been. I think he understood the situation, but was able to use that visual rhetoric, that visual situation to his advantage and create a public spectacle, because he knew that this could become something the public was watching, the public would see, right? And if he can at least use the camera angle of empty seats, right? Even though persons are always moving in and out of Congress hearings. I mean, that's standard operating procedure. People are coming and going quite regularly, but the general public does not know this, right? And so Stewart uses that to his advantage to really get an issue through that he cared strongly about. And obviously it helped that he had a bunch of 9/11 first responders surrounding him, and that ethos was certainly coming through as well. But I think that Congress has potentially been a little slow in recognizing that the cameras and microphones are there and that they need to be acting accordingly, at least to maintain the public persona. But I think as of recent years, without question, they've recognized it's there and that they're using it to their advantage. Have I addressed the question well?
I think so. Oh, you weren't asking me.
Oh, well, yeah, Sheri, jump in, please.
The video that I'm hoping to show tomorrow is very different from the one that Josh is describing, because what it shows is a member of Congress using words to browbeat a celebrity citizen advocate into silence. I'm not sure, and this is one of the questions I'm going to ask. I'm not sure if the celebrity is stunned or whether he simply has no words for that. And I look forward to discussing that with you tomorrow.
Thank you so much. I know we are out of time, but I wanted to thank our authors, panelists, Drs. Guitar, Bleam, and Hopper. I appreciate reading your work and hearing your work today. Thank you, Dr. Browning and Andrea, for having me on as moderator. It's a great privilege. And of course, I thank the C-SPAN archives. And I hope everyone enjoys the rest of the conference. I will join in as much as I can. Thank you so much, Andrea or Dr. Browning, before we end.
Very, very good. I'm fascinated by the ability to take 40 years and or 35 years and watch the transition of one person. Yeah. You know, I can see how you could do policy change across time, but I had never thought about it being one person. And as others said, you know, looking at somebody like Richard Lugar or Sam Nunn and the evolution of their policies, it's be a fascinating study. And I'm sure Catherine Burnell is listening as a historian to this kind of discussion. So very good start for our conference.
Thank you, Robert.